Today we're going to talk about and get introduced to our lesson on the early Middle Ages, which starts somewhere around 500 AD and ends around 1400 AD. Now, the Middle Ages basically starts when Rome falls, all right? When the city of Rome falls and the western part of the Roman Empire falls, that's when this time period in European history called the Middle Ages starts. And it's going to end with the start of the Renaissance, the rebirth of learning that's going to start in Italy and then spread all over Europe starting around 1400 AD. So those 900 years in between are called the Middle Ages, also called medieval times. And we'll talk about a little bit later on why it was also called medieval times. Now, if you look at the images, this is the time of kings, this is the time of queens, this is the time of castles and cathedrals. This is the time period where if you have any European ancestry in you, and this is, and your blood goes way back, this is the time period where your history starts. And towns like London and Paris and Hamburg and others form during this time period in what we call the Middle Ages. Now, we got to go back to Western Europe, and the last time we were there, if you recall, the western part of the Roman Empire was falling. And it was falling at the hands of all of these barbarian tribes. Now, some of these tribes stayed, some of them left. As you can see, the territories in AD 500, when the Middle Ages is going to start, you can see exactly who stayed, all right? So, for example, you can look at the Franks. They went and they stayed in France, in what is now France and what was then Gaul. You can see up north, even the Angles and the Saxons are going to stay. The Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals. The Visigoths in Spain are going to stay and set up these kingdoms. Now, these people, if you recall, didn't really care about education too much. They couldn't read, they couldn't write very well, as you can imagine. They were farmers, they were herders. They didn't have any cities and barely had too many laws. The laws that they had, they brought with them. Now, the most famous of all these groups were probably the Franks, and that's where we get the word France from and French from. And the great King Charlemagne in 760 AD is going to be probably the most prominent and influential king of any of these early civilizations that start within what we call the Middle Ages. And we'll come back to Charlemagne here in a second. So Charlemagne is going to die after creating these kingdoms, and the board game chess, for example, was created during this time period by him and so on. He's going to die, and then these invaders are going to get invaded, all right? So yes, the old invaders of Rome, the western part of the Roman Empire, these Vandals, these Visigoths, these Franks, they're going to be invaded, okay? And they're going to be invaded by three groups of people. They're going to be invaded by the Vikings, they're going to be invaded by the Muslims, and they're going to be invaded by the Magyars. Now, if you look closely at this map, you can see the blue arrows represent the Vikings. And the Vikings are going to be the great sailors, all right? It was said that there wasn't a waterway in Europe that the Vikings had not sailed on. Now, to the south, we already did our lesson on Islam and the Muslims, and you can see that the orange arrows represent Muslim territory and how they advanced into Europe. In fact, if you look to the far west of the map, you can see in Spain that they actually advance all the way up into what is now present-day France and almost to Paris, and actually were halted by the Franks at the Battle of Tours, all right? It stopped and halted Muslim advance into Europe forever, which if this battle had been won by the Muslims, who knows? Maybe the history of Europe would be much different. There's a group called the Magyars that came from the east in the green arrows that aren't going to be around very long, but they are going to be considered invaders that did invade the old invaders of the western part of the Roman Empire. Now, to protect themselves from these invaders, the Franks, the Visigoths, they all adopted a political system, and it happened to be a political system of medieval Europe, and it's called feudalism. Now, feudalism is the political system of Western Europe. Now, this is where kings and upper class people, nobles, are going to grant land, which they called a fief, a piece of land called a fief. You might see it called a fiefdom, to other nobles in return for loyalty and service. And the reason why they had to do this because they had to protect themselves. They had to protect themselves from the Vikings. They had to protect themselves from the Magyars. They had to protect themselves from the Muslims. And what's going to be created here are very, very loyal little kingdoms. Kingdoms that pop up all over medieval Europe, all over Western Europe, in the countries of England and France and Germany and Spain and Italy. All these little kingdoms are going to pop up. Now, basically what happened was you indirectly signed what they called a feudal contract. Okay? So if a king or someone above you on the social chain granted you a piece of land, you had to work that land. You had to be loyal to your king. You had to be loyal. There are services that we'll talk about here a little bit more specifically that you had to do for the person that was above you on the social rank within this class structure that we'll talk about here in a second. So by taking this piece of land, and you didn't sign a contract like we sign a mortgage for a home or when you buy a car. We didn't sign a contract like that. It was an unwritten rule that if you were given land, you owed the person that gave you land, okay? Now, in this time, there were no central government, so that's what I said a second ago. A bunch of these kingdoms popped up all over the place, and there wasn't one kingdom that was in charge of all the kingdoms. Every individual kingdom was their own little political structure and entity. They did not have to listen to anyone except for their king. Now, here's a social class system of medieval Europe, or what we call feudal society. Now, it's one of the most interesting and unique feudal systems or social classes in the history of the world. One, because there are 5 groups, okay? So at the top was a king, and below the king was someone called a lord, and below the lord was someone called a vassal. Now, these vassals, if you want to put in parentheses lesser lords, that's what they were called as well. Below the vassals, or what they were also called or referred to as lesser lords, were the knights and then the peasants. Now, this diagram shows you that the nobility basically was made up of every class of people except for the peasants and townspeople. Okay, so the knights, the vassals, the lords, and the king were all considered the nobility. Were all considered nobles. Now, the real fun thing about this social class is that you could possibly be a lord and a vassal at the same time. At the same time. Now, let me explain that. So, if the king would grant land to a lord, that lord on that social chain I just showed you is a vassal to the king. But that lord can also take that big piece of land that we called a fief and grant it to a vassal or a lesser lord. And in that case, the lord is a lord to the vassal. But since that lord received land from the king, that lord is a vassal to the king and a lord to the vassal that he in turn granted that land to, okay? So it's a very unique structure where there is a situation where a man could be a lord and a vassal at the same time, So the lord, if you grant land to someone, you're a lord. If you do hold the land and you tend the land for the lord, you're a vassal. All right, it's as simple as that. The only people in medieval society that were never vassals was the king. The king was not a vassal to anyone, okay? So very personal relationships are going to form here. Now, this diagram shows you, it's called the feudal pyramid of power, and it shows you what goes down the chain and what goes up the chain. So as I just explained, to the right of the diagram, you can see that land is passed down through the ranks, to the lords, to the vassals, to the knights, to the peasants, and so on. What goes back up the pyramid of power are the services. So if a peasant, back then there wasn't a money economy yet. Money had not hit medieval Europe. So a peasant would work the land and then would give food and services up to the knights and the vassals, okay? The knights would give military protection to the nobles that granted them land, all right? The nobles who had money later on in medieval times and their warriors would give those money and give those warriors to the king in times of battle and so on, okay? So you had to be very close, you had to be very tight, and you didn't want to leave the land because, there were other people out there that wanted to take that was yours. The Vikings, the Muslims, the Magyars early, and then other surrounding kingdoms. And we will see kingdoms go to battle. Now, if you're a vassal, let's talk about a couple of those obligations, all right? First off, in times of battle, you had to serve in the king's cavalry and infantry for a time of about 40 days, all right? So when your kingdom went to war, it was your obligation to your king, it was your obligation to your lord that you served in the king's cavalry, or you served in the king's infantry, or your lord's cavalry, or your lord's infantry. As I stated a second ago, there were financial obligations. The lower you were, you would give chickens up the chain. You would give service. You would give your loyalty, your support. All right, those types of things were given back up the chain. Now, There were certain times when the Lord or the king would come out to visit. They'd ride out to the countryside and just check up on you, check out on their piece of land, see how you were tending it, see how the farming was going, and so on. And as a vassal, it was your job, it was your obligation to house the Lord and feed the Lord when he would come to visit. Now, as we recall from our lessons on the Roman Empire, Christianity by 300 AD was already surging through parts of the Roman Empire. By 600 AD, obviously on this map, almost every part of the medieval Europe or the Roman Empire, the old Roman Empire that we know, was Christian, all right? By 800, every area within the old part of the Roman Empire, especially the West, was Christian. Christianity spread like wildfire because of Constantine, because of Paul, because of the spreaders, the apostles, and so on. It spread fast, and it caught on. So these were very Christian kingdoms. As a vassal, it was your job to attend the marriages of your lord, and they had church services. You would go to church on Sundays, all right? Everything would shut down. Churches would open, and you would go to church services, Christian church services on Sundays, just like we do today. Now, the church is going to support the hierarchy. So the church that we're talking about is the medieval church. The medieval church was the Catholic Church, okay? So we're talking about the Catholic Church here that's going to support this hierarchy of the social feudal society with the king, the lord, the vassal, the knight, and the peasant. And there's a lot of support there. Now, you wouldn't think on the manor or within these kingdoms there'd be a lot of trouble. You didn't really want to make trouble. But sometimes there were trouble. And you'd get in trouble for stealing things, simple things like that, like you would do back in the old parts of the empire. So in the old days, if you had a problem with someone or if you stole your neighbor's chicken, you'd go before your lord and they would put a sword in your hand. And you would fight it out. You would fight it out, trial by battle. If you won the fight, in some cases very early on, if you were killed, obviously you were guilty. If you lived, you were innocent of that crime. So one fascinating part of medieval society was their medieval justice. And the first example of that is trial by battle. Now, the second thing that would happen is you would take an oath, all right? You would go before your lord. You would go and you would bring a couple of your friends, and your friends would vouch for you, saying that you're a good kid, you've never lied, you never cheated, you never stole, you had a bad day, and the Lord would basically make you take an oath, and you would have to take an oath saying that you would never do that again, okay? And that would be a warning for you. Other more fun parts of medieval society was something called the ordeal. Now, the ordeal is something that we have heard of before. When we watched our film on Mesopotamia early on in the first quarter, you saw a guy licking a red-hot spoon. It was a Bedouin tribesman that was said to have stolen something. He had to lick a hot spoon. And remember, his tongue, and a soothsayer would come and look at his tongue and see if he was innocent or guilty. That's the first time that we saw an example of an ordeal. Well, these images are fantastic of looking at what medieval justice was like, or what the medieval ordeal was like. You can see in the bottom left image, you can see that you could get racked, you could stretch, and those guys are turning two poles, which are basically moving that guy's arms and legs in different directions, attempting to dislocate his shoulders and his hips, okay? If you could withstand that punishment, you would be considered innocent of your crime. If not, you would be considered guilty. They would heat up in the middle image a hot cauldron, and they would force you to put your arm in there for a long period of time. If you could handle the pain, you were considered innocent. If not, you were considered guilty. You've seen people walking across hot coals. You can just simply look at the image to the bottom right, and you can see the chair full of nails. You can see all the medieval torture devices there, which some of you are very interested in, that we'll talk about a little bit more. So basically, the whole theme of this slide is you probably did not want to get in trouble within the kingdom during medieval times. Now, basically, that was the political structure of medieval Europe, okay? Feudalism, the granting of land, the loyalty, the service, the pyramid of power. Now, the economic system of the medieval times was based on the medieval manor, okay? So a manor was a huge estate, all right? So imagine this huge, huge chunk of land. And in the middle of the estate was the manor house. That's where the lord of the manor would live. There would be fields surrounding that, villages surrounding that. The lesser lords would live in the villages. The knights, the peasants would all live within the lord's manor. Now, this diagram shows you a very good idea about what a typical medieval manor would look like. You can see that The manor house is right there in the middle. The lord would have his own orchard. The close is what he could do, whatever he wanted to do. You can see that these manors all had, eventually later on when paper and printing came to medieval Europe, they had a press, they had an oven, they had a mill. If you look very closely, you can see that this diagram shows that this manor, all of them were built around a water source, okay? Away from the manor house, you can see the village. The bigger squares in the village might represent the lesser lords, the vassals, the knights. The smaller squares would represent where the peasants would live. You also see a square with a steeple on top, okay? So yes, like I said a second ago, there were churches and church services. Everyone would stop what they were doing in the manor, and they would go to church on Sundays. You can see the different fields that they would have. They did practice crop rotation. You can see the autumn field, the spring field, fallow fields. Fallow are sheep and where their animals would go and so on, okay? And that's where all these people would live, and you wanted to live on the manor. Now, if there was one word that I could use to describe a medieval manor, all of them were self-sufficient. They made their own clothes. They produced their own food. They did everything within the walls of that manor, within the confines of the manor, because, like I said a second ago, you did not want to leave your area. You did not want to leave your territory because there were invaders there that would want you and your stuff, basically. And later on, other kingdoms fought against each other for resources and so on. Now, women and children, your status in society is going to improve tremendously because when the men were off fighting at war and away from the manor, you had to tend to the daily activities there around the manor. So it's not exactly a great reason for status to improve, but women and children during medieval times did see their status improved tremendously for that reason. So like I said, the medieval manor was shared by the vassals, the knights, and the peasants, okay? So let's stop for a second and let's talk about the knights, all right? Because they're usually fun to talk about. Now, the knights within medieval times, you wanted to be a knight. If you were born of noble birth, there was one thing that you wanted to do, and you wanted to be a knight, all right? It was like you wanted to be a professional athlete these days, or a singer, or an actor, or something like that. This is what you wanted to be. If you were born of noble birth, you wanted to be a knight. And the reason why they're glorified in medieval times is because of probably, they were the fighters. They were the protectors of the realm. So their armor, you can see the chainmail that we'll talk about, and we'll see a little bit more, the helmets, the shield, the sword, the lance, the joust. I mean, they were just glorified, the most glorified people of the manor of medieval society, right just below the kings, okay? And it was really cool to be a knight. Now, they lived by a certain code, and the code of all the knights is called chivalry. And it was a code that all knights pretty much had to live with, okay? The code was very simple. You fought fair, you didn't lie, you didn't cheat, you didn't steal. If you were fighting an opposing knight in battle and he dropped his sword, for example, you would have to wait, pause your fight, pause your little battle until he was armed, because there was no honor in killing him, and it was basically against the code of conduct for killing an unarmed knight. If he got scared and ran away from you, knights did not stab each other in the back, all right? It was against the code of conduct for these knights. Now, early on in medieval times, it was very simple to become a knight. If you killed a knight in battle, you took his armor and you called yourself a knight. Later on in medieval times, it was a little bit more intricate, all right? And you had to go through stages of training. Now, what would happen was when you were about 6 or 7 years old, when you were a jit, your mom and dad would literally send you off to a knight, and they would pay the knight to teach you how to become a knight. The knight would house you, the knight would feed you. The first stage of training to become a knight, you had a title. You were called a page. At about 6 or 7 years old, you were shipped off. And he taught you manners, he taught you weaponry. You were this little guy that was being trained by this knight in order to become a knight someday. Now, the second stage of training is when they got to be about your age, into your teens. You graduated from being a page and you became the knight's squire. The squire. So in your teens, you became the knight's assistant. So you would ride with the knight in battle. If you were going to tournaments, you would prepare the horse, you would prepare the knight for the joust, the sword fight, and things that we'll finish our lesson with today and so on. And that was pretty simple. So you started off as a page, then you became a squire, and the very last thing that you had to do was to prove yourself in battle. In order for you to become a knight, you had to prove yourself in battle, fighting right alongside your knight. And if you could do that, well, then there was a very ornate ceremony where the knight would place his sword on one shoulder, sword on the other shoulder, and then he would slap you across the face as hard as he could just to make you remember the vows that you took and to remember basically the code of conduct of the knights, this chivalrous way to handle yourself, okay? Now, the peasants that lived in the villages, that lived in the manor, were also called serfs, okay? So you'll see that word again. Now, peasants were bound to the land, but they weren't slaves, all right? Peasants were at the bottom of the barrel of social society, but they had a place to live. They had food most of the time, and all they had to do was work the land, okay? And once again, you didn't want to leave the medieval manor. You weren't bound to the land. But you didn't want to leave because of everything out there that basically was going to go against you, okay? Now, a typical diet of a peasant or a serf within these medieval manors consisted of bread and cabbage. They drank a lot of beer. The average age of a peasant was the lowest of anybody that would live in the medieval manor. They lived to be about 40 years old, which is not very long. Many of them died of disease. Sometimes the water was not hygienic enough for them. They died of cholera. They died of stomach diseases and so on, different things like that. And starvation was rampant amongst the peasants in the manor, because if there was a time of bad harvest in the manor, in a time of bad harvest, the king is going to eat. He's still going to eat, okay? The lords are going to eat. The vassals are going to eat. You have to feed the knights because they're the protectors of the realm and they're the fighters. If there's no food left over, guess who didn't eat? It was the peasants and the serfs, and that's why their life expectancy was not very long. Now, the nobles, later on, they first started, the lords would live in a manor house, all right? Well, later on in medieval times, the manor homes became castles. And medieval castles is a lesson that we'll finish with today, and we'll look at a few of them, were built for defensive purposes because as the Middle Ages went along, these kingdoms and kings and lords knew that they needed to be protected from invaders and from other kingdoms when they were invaded. Now, one castle that I like to highlight is a castle there to the right, which is called Neuschwanstein. It's a castle that's in Füssen, Germany, and it's a place that I've actually been to before. I hopped on a train, and they said, you got to go see this castle. It just basically sticks right out of the mountains of Germany. It's a beautiful place, right outside of Munich, which a lot of people have been to. And one very important person that had been there a very long time ago was a guy named Walt Disney. And if you're looking at this castle and you think it looks familiar, well, guess what? The replica of this castle in Germany is sitting right in the middle of Disney World in Orlando, all right? All the Disney Worlds and all the Disneylands have a castle, and they're basically the replicas of this actual castle that Walt Disney traveled to see in Germany called Neuschwanstein. Now, later on in medieval times, the fighting had subsided, and when the fighting subsided, there were tournaments, there were competitions that kings would have, and kings would invite knights from other kingdoms to come and compete in tournaments. That word tournament that we have, comes from this time period where knights would invite kings would invite other knights from other kingdoms to their kingdom to come to compete, and the typical events in these tournaments were called the joust, all right? The joust image there is to the top. You can see that the knights would ride at each other with their lances in an attempt to knock off their horse. Score was kept, okay? If you would knock the knight off the horse completely, you would win the entire match. If you had a headshot, you would get 2 points. If you had a shot to the body, and that would be 1 point, and the first knight that would reach 3 points would win that event. And it was the most important event, the most glorified event to win in these tournaments was the joust. The top left image, you can see colors, okay? Little kids would wear the colors of their team, just like we wear our mascots, just like we wear. They had something called a coat of arms, which was the label, which was the design for each knight. And the knight, when he would go to the motel or the pub to live, he would take his coat of arms off his horse and he would put it out front so everybody could see that this knight was staying there. And then you would go to the joust the next day and cheer on your knight, just like we cheer on our professional sports teams and college teams to this day. Sword fighting was an event. Falconry was something that was practiced during that time. Archery was an event. And like I said, these modern day sports like tennis and soccer and hockey and polo and lacrosse all stem from medieval times, all right? So there are some total lasting effects and a lot of fun stuff that we're going to learn about here when we talk about our lesson on medieval times.